It's my feeling, I don't know whether it is yours, that we should have a coffee break.
On News Magazine tonight, 2 men in political conflict. To report, Ron Collister.
Good evening. With me tonight is Peter Daniel, the CBC's Quebec provincial correspondent. Quebec Premier Johnson and Mr. Trudeau, maybe a Liberal leadership candidate, have been saying harsh words about each other here today. It's the story of the day at the Constitutional Conference. It began in the conference, but was interrupted by a peacemaking Prime Minister Pearson, who called a coffee break. But it built up in statements made outside. Mr. Johnson saw Mr. Trudeau as a leadership candidate in search of votes, and a man who did not speak for the federal government. Mr. Pearson corrected that impression, and Mr. Trudeau said the people, presumably in an election, should decide who does speak for Quebec. Despite the Johnson-Trudeau row, it was a good day for governments at the conference today. Mr. Johnson took a moderate position. The consensus on language rights across the country appeared to gel, but there is clearly no consensus yet on enshrining a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. A debate began on economic inequalities in the country, some say as damaging an issue to national unity as any other. Peter Daniel, why did Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Johnson fall out?
Well, the 2 men have been at odds since plans were first announced by Ottawa to entrench a Bill of Rights and a new constitution. The Quebec position has been, and it is still essentially the same, the rights should be guaranteed in a provincial constitution. Mr. Johnson has repeatedly contended that civil and property rights are provincial jurisdiction, and as with any other acknowledged power, he refuses to give it up or even have it watered down. Mr. Trudeau has been quite firm on his intentions, with the argument advanced today that there cannot be disparities on these matters across the country. It may be pointed out that several other premiers have reservations on this point and have used the phrase heard so often today, "We hold in reserve our position." The end of the argument seems to have been some vague indications from both Mr. Trudeau and Premier Johnson that they may be able to work something out. Ron?
We interviewed Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Johnson, and Prime Minister Pearson separately. I asked Mr. Trudeau what were the issues that set him and Mr. Johnson apart.
Well, I wouldn't say the issues set us apart. I was trying to find out if his position did set us apart. I must say I haven't found out. But I was trying to discover and perhaps make Mr. Johnson say what his unstated major premises are when he talks about the Constitution. As you saw, I was trying to find out what equality means in his phrase, equality or independence, because I feel that as a French Canadian in Ottawa, and from what I've seen of the other Canadians around, they are prepared to recognize equality in a certain sense. Surely the positions taken by the majority of the provincial premiers saying what they would do in terms of recognition of linguistic rights in their provinces, putting French in their provinces more or less on an equal basis of that of English in the Quebec province. This is my conception of equality, and this is something, as a federal member of Parliament, that I am prepared to fight for. And I was trying to find out if this is what the equality meant when it's used in the Quebec brief. Or did it mean something more? Did it mean equality in this sense, plus special powers to Quebec? So, I wouldn't say that there was a difference of opinion in the sense that I'm not quite sure what the Quebec delegation wants. I'm not quite sure that they know what they want either. Or perhaps they are only playing a game. Perhaps it's a very subtle and sophisticated game, you know, of being a moving target. This is part of the strategy, too. But surely it's our counter-strategy to know what changes they want before beginning to say, okay, we will agree to them.
Well, given these positions and these uncertainties, is there an area of reconciliation between you and Mr. Johnson?
Yes, I think the area of reconciliation is the extension of the notion of equality to the French language. On this, I think most French Canadians would agree, no matter what their party. Beyond this, I think perhaps we will have to, at some point, take it to the people. Perhaps the French Canadians themselves will have to be asked what equality they want. If one government says one thing at the provincial level and the other government says another thing at the federal level, we will have to ask the people. But even then, in asking the people, we must spell it out. We must say, this is the equality that we are fighting for. And Mr. Johnson will have to say, this is a different kind of equality that I am fighting for. And then the people will choose. And of course, the other provinces will choose too. Do they want to have a federal form of government, a constitution in which my kind of equality will be entrenched? And if so, I will agree. I will sit down and write a new constitution with them. Or do they prefer the kind of equality that Mr. Johnson would spell out if he gets around to spelling one out? And if so, let them negotiate on that basis. But we have to know, we've been talking about a new constitution in this country for half a dozen years. And still we're not quite sure what people want to put into it. That's why the federal government itself was reluctant to start constitutional conferences too soon, because it was obvious from the statements of the provincial premiers, first Lesage and now Johnson, that they weren't prepared to spell out precisely what they wanted.
Mr. Johnson, you told us yesterday that the door was ajar. How far apart is it today? How wide's the opening?
Well, it all depends who is talking for the federal government. If it is the book that we read yesterday in purpose to state the official federal position, then I feel that the door is still open. But if it is Mr. Trudeau who speaks for the federal, then it seems that a few doors have been slammed.
Mr. Johnson was very angry with you today, and I presume that you were quite angry with him. He told reporters that the door, which was slightly ajar yesterday, was closed if you represented federal government policies.
Did he say that? Well, I'm sure the door will be opened again, and then it'll be closed again and opened again according to the mood of the day. Of course I represent federal policies. These policies have been hammered out in cabinet, and they are part of our document, which I assume you read.
Oh, sure.
And they're a rejection of any special status of any magnitude for any province, and they're an assertion of our kind of federalism. And I think basically that Mr. Johnson himself will come around to accepting that. I think now it's good tactics for him to say that the door is closed, perhaps thinking that he will frighten us into changing our minds. But we're not easily moved by ultimatums.
But don't you think there's something personal and political in the relationship between you and Mr. Johnson at this time? I think he did throw out the label candidate, presumably in the Liberal leadership race. And
yes, that was a personal touch, perhaps it's good. It's certainly good politics in Quebec to try and attack my ideas by saying that I'm trying to advance my cause as a hypothetical candidate, except the fallacy in that argument is that Mr. Johnson knows, and the people of Quebec know, that I've been saying these things for 15 years. And I've been saying them long before I got into politics. And therefore, it shouldn't be surprising that I'm saying them today at the first federal-provincial conference on the Constitution, in which I've had anything to say.
If Mr. Trudeau's doctrine, as expressed this morning, was put into action, then this would be a sure way of blowing up Canada.
Do you reject Mr. Trudeau as a spokesman for the federal government, sir?
No, I do not, but between the written text that we had before us and a brilliant improvisation this morning, I feel that, I feel more secure with the text.
Mr. Johnson, what about this argument about who speaks for French Canada, you or Mr. Trudeau? You think we're going to resolve this, or have you made up your mind on that fact?
I do not think that we should resolve that here. There are facts that we can't deny. I'm not only a member for Bagot County. I'm not only a member of a cabinet, which is evidently split, but I am the leader of a party and the prime minister of a province with a cabinet which is not split as people think it is on this matter. This brief has the backing of the whole cabinet, unanimous backing of the whole cabinet, and it is in accordance with our published program, with previous stands that we took publicly, and especially in Toronto. Anyway.
Someone mentioned there was a very chummy lunch a couple of weeks ago between Mr. Trudeau and yourself. What has happened in the interim, sir?
Well, I hope that people can realize that there's a difference between the time of the game and after the game. I know certain hockey players are quite tough on the ice because they're playing opposite teams, and then they can have a beer together and a steak. It's the same thing in politics. I do not agree with Mr. Trudeau. It's quite clear that he doesn't agree with me. But on a personal level, I don't see why we would carry any grudges. Civilized people. He is a very intelligent man, pleasant man. We had a good dinner, a very good dinner together. We could agree in many areas, but it seems that what changes the whole nature of the problem, that he is actually running, or will be running, eventually, I'm not breaking any news to anyone, as one of the contenders for the leadership and the job of Prime Minister. And it would be asking too much from any man, as intelligent as he may be, even as intelligent as Mr. Trudeau, to forget that he's running, that he's in a race to become leader of the Liberal Party. So let's say it's harder for him to forget the political angle than it is for me at this time.
Do you feel that you're now one of 10 partners and still one of the two, or how is this sort of geometric theory?
Well, I feel that we're sitting at the board meeting and that there is some differences between some of us, but I feel that we have made progress. There was a major breakthrough, and this should not be forgotten. The Trudeau incident and Mr. Smallwood's intervention yesterday tend to obliterate what had been done yesterday, and in my estimation, that is very important. One of the basic requirements of French Canadians feeling more and more Canadian is that they would have their linguistic and school rights recognized all over Canada. And yesterday, there was a breakthrough, none of which has ever occurred. And it has been a problem for, 100 years now. We have had campaigns and protests and all sorts of manifestations, but in 2 days, this has been débloqué in such a way that I think it should be marked by a white stone.